The Dark Scrolls. They came at dawn, not with armies, but with fire, not for territory, but for flesh. The first to hear them were the monks of Lindisfarne, cloistered in a lonely stone abbey on the edge of the known world. They believed their gods were gentle, their silence holy, and their prayers strong enough to keep evil at bay. But silence meant nothing to the ones who sailed out of the north. Their ships were long and low, cutting through the sea like blades, carved with snarling dragon heads that warned of what was to come. When they landed, the Vikings did not speak. They screamed. And what followed was not a battle. It was a taking, a violation, a desecration of every boundary the Christian world had drawn between man and beast. These were not just raiders. They were emissaries of a world where violence and sex were not opposites, but partners, where power was not merely about killing, but about domination in every possible sense. These were men raised in a culture where conquest was a sacred act, and where the flesh of others, especially women, was part of the spoils of war. To understand what drove them, one must first forget the world we know. The Christian moral compass of sin, shame, and purity had no place in the longhouses of Scandinavia. There, sex was not hidden. It was not sacred. It was simply there, like the sea, like the sword, like the fire in a warrior's veins. The gods themselves blurred every line. Loki, the trickster, was said to have turned into a mare and given birth to a foal. Odin, the All-Father, practiced a magic so powerful it was considered unmanly because it required submission, not dominance. Even Thor, the hammer-wielder, once disguised himself as a bride to reclaim his weapon. In Viking mythology, power was fluid, but in Viking society, power was hard, violent, visible, and often soaked in blood. The first Viking raids were not about empire. They were about hunger for land, for gold, for bodies, and when a Viking longship docked uninvited, it was not to negotiate. It was to take. Gold, yes. Livestock, always. But the women, they were the true prize. A successful raid was not just measured in treasure, but in how many wombs were captured, how many bloodlines could be rewritten by the seed of the North. Some women were taken as wives, others for breeding. Most were simply used in ways too brutal to recount. And yet, within Viking villages, the treatment of women was layered with contradiction. Norse women could own property. They could divorce their husbands. Some even ruled in times of war. But that freedom at home only sharpened the cruelty abroad, for outside their own people there was no equality, no negotiation, only power. And power was proven by the right to dominate. The slaves, thralls as they were called, bore the brunt of this domination. They were not merely unpaid workers, they were currency, spoils, flesh to be passed around or sold off. On raids, Viking ships were loaded with Slavic girls, Irish nuns, Frankish daughters, stripped of their names, their homes, their dignity. They were marked, sometimes branded, sometimes broken by routine. And once brought to the homestead, they were kept out of sight, often beneath the floorboards of longhouses, sleeping beside livestock, waiting to be summoned, to serve, to satisfy. Some bore children, others raised the children of their masters. They were not just victims, they were invisible architects of Viking homes. And yet their pain remained unspoken, passed down not through sagas, but through silence. Even death was not spared from this sexual logic. In 921, the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed something extraordinary on the banks of the Volga. A Norse chieftain had died, his body laid upon a ship surrounded by treasure and slaughtered animals. But then came the ritual. A slave girl volunteered, or was chosen, to join him in death. For 10 days she was fed, adorned, and forced to lie with every man in the village. Each would finish, and she would whisper, "Tell my master I did this for him." On the final day, she was given strong drink. Then the angel of death, an old woman with wild eyes and a dagger, stabbed her in the ribs while other women beat their drums. Her body was placed next to the dead man. The ship was set on fire. It was not just a funeral, it was a union, a declaration that even in death, the chieftain's power extended into flesh, into screams, into the next world. And this was not rare. It was considered honorable. The belief was that Valhalla, the great hall of fallen warriors, was not entered by mere death. It required glory, violence, women, fire, sex, and death, braided together like the cords of a funeral pyre. This was the world of the Viking raider, a world where the sea carried not just warriors, but rituals, where behind every burning monastery was a woman dragged by her hair, where behind every buried axe was a life taken for pleasure, not just conquest, and where the gods watched not with judgment, but with pride. And this was only the beginning. They believed they were chosen, not in the way Christians thought of divine purpose, but chosen by chaos itself, by the storms, by the blood that refused to clot, by the hunger that could never be sated. After every raid, after every body burned or defiled, the longships returned not with shame but with songs, songs of glory, of torn veils and broken gates, songs where names of villages were replaced by the names of women taken. And at the center of those songs were men who had become more than men. The berserkers. They were not a myth. They were a class of warriors so feared that even their own kin kept distance. Naked but for animal skins, eyes wide with the madness of gods, they would charge into battle foaming at the mouth, immune to pain, immune to mercy. But their frenzy did not end with blood. For many, the berserker state bled into all parts of life. They didn't return from battle and resume the roles of husbands or fathers. They remained in that other world, a place where sex was indistinguishable from violence, where pleasure and pain were one and the same. Some sagas whisper of their rituals, ceremonies that involved bloodletting, forced penetration, and human sacrifice. Of caves where berserkers drank fermented wolf blood and fornicated while howling to Fenrir, the great wolf destined to eat the gods. Of women offered not to marry, but to break, to tear down and remake in the image of war itself. These weren't orgies. They were transformations. To become a berserker was to abandon the rules of man and enter the hunger of beast. And yet, the very society that bred such men also feared them, not for what they could do with a sword, but for what they might do without one. There are accounts of villages waking to find entire households torn apart, not by enemies, but by a berserker returned from battle and unable to let go of his rage. And often it was the women who bore the worst of it, raped, disfigured, sometimes even eaten. These were not acts of strategy, they were declarations that a man touched by the gods could no longer be touched by laws. But not all Viking sexual rituals were soaked in violence. Some were bound to fertility, to the seasons, to the land. In certain parts of Scandinavia, the first furrow of a field in spring was sometimes plowed by a naked couple, believing their union would awaken the soil. In others, women were believed to carry the spirit of harvest and were ceremonially shared before the start of planting season, an act meant to ensure abundance. These customs blurred the lines between faith and flesh, duty and desire. Still, even these rituals carried an undertone of force, for it was never the woman who chose. It was the village, the elders, the gods. Her body was not hers. It was a vessel for the survival of the tribe. The contradictions piled up like bones beneath a longhouse. This was a culture that honored the shield maiden, the woman who rode into battle. But it was also a culture where the same woman, if captured, would be raped until she forgot how to stand. It was a culture where men sang poems of love, metaphors laced with snow and longing, but also kept slaves chained beneath their beds, where sex could be both the reward for bravery and the punishment for weakness. And those contradictions didn't go unnoticed by the world beyond. To the Christian monks of Ireland and Northumbria, the Vikings were more than pagans. They were incarnations of lust unchained. They documented the rapes with trembling hands, calling them sacrilegious unions. Churches were defiled not just with blood, but with semen. Crucifixes used as tools of humiliation. There are records of monks being castrated in front of their altars, and nuns who were taken, then returned pregnant, forced to birth what they called children of hell. In the East, Slavic tribes feared the Vikings not only as raiders, but as merchants of flesh. For the Vikings didn't just take slaves, they sold them. The rivers from the Baltic to Byzantium flowed with long ships carrying men, women, and children to markets in Baghdad, Cairo, and Constantinople. And in those markets, the Vikings were not seen as savages, but as businessmen, cool, efficient, and ruthless. The Anglo-Saxons fared no better. In their chronicles, they speak of heathen marriage, a term used not for union but for violation. Entire villages would be emptied of women, and yet, a decade later, those same villages would be filled again with sons who bore the eyes of the North, raised not by invaders, but by mothers who no longer remembered any other life. The psychological warfare was just as brutal as the physical. To violate a man's daughter was to dishonor his bloodline. To impregnate his wife was to steal his legacy. The Vikings understood this. They wove it into their strategy. Sexual conquest wasn't incidental, it was intentional. It broke resistance faster than any siege. And yet, amid this tapestry of pain, there were moments of unsettling humanity. Some thralls became concubines, then wives. Some Viking men fell in love with their captives, offered them freedom, even land. There are sagas of Irish girls who rose to become queens in Danish courts, of women who bore sons that would become kings. But these stories are rare and often sanitized. For every one woman who rose, 100 more were silenced beneath fur and snow. The violence was not a bug in the system. It was the system. The Norse worldview was unapologetic. Death was not an ending, but a transformation. And sex. It was a bridge between worlds, a tool of war, a form of worship, a weapon, a gift, a curse. It could be brutal or beautiful, but it was never neutral. By the time the Christian world began to push back, with swords, with missions, with kings who claimed divine right, the Viking Age was already leaving its mark, not just on bloodlines, but on memory, on myth, on the whispered truths that history prefers to forget. Because the real horror was never the axe, it was what came after the screaming stopped. And when the screaming stopped, when the fires smoldered, and the last cry of a violated village faded into the sea wind, something else began. Not silence, not peace, but absorption. Like blood in cloth, the stain didn't wash away. It spread. The most disturbing truth about the Viking raiders wasn't just their brutality or their rituals soaked in violence and sex. It was how deeply their influence seeped into the cultures they once ravaged. Europe did not only survive the Viking onslaught, in many ways it adapted to it. And in that adaptation came transformation, not resistance, not purity, but a quiet kind of inheritance. Some of the very societies that cursed the Northmen would, within a generation, adopt their customs, intermarry, trade, even venerate. The Vikings, once feared as demons of the sea, began to appear in royal bloodlines, in local legends, in church scrolls rewritten to soften the sins of ancestors who had once bowed beneath fur-clad men and bore their children. But what of those who remembered the worst of it? What of the women? They carried the legacy not in scrolls or poems, but in their bodies. A generation of half-Norse, half-native children was born in silence, in shame, in shadow. Sons who looked nothing like their mother's kin. Daughters who inherited the blue of northern eyes and the ache of southern wounds. There were whispers that such children were cursed, born of violence, unwanted by both gods. And yet, some of them rose. Some of them, ironically, became bridges between cultures, trading knowledge, settling disputes, leading raids of their own. But even as time passed and Viking ships were replaced by trade routes and treaties, the core contradictions of their legacy never disappeared, especially when it came to sexuality. Within Norse settlements across the British Isles, the old ways were not entirely abandoned. Certain rituals endured. Among them, the practice of mourning brides, where newly captured women were forcibly paired with warriors, sometimes with mock ceremonies, sometimes with nothing more than a grunt of approval from a chieftain. These women were expected to bear children within a year, or be traded again. Their value was not their story, it was their fertility. And then there were the blood feasts. These were not as widespread, but they left an imprint far darker than any battlefield. In parts of Iceland and northern Norway, there were tales of sacrificial rites where women, often slaves, sometimes accused of witchcraft, were bound and used in fertility ceremonies under the open sky, their bodies painted with runes, their arms tied to standing stones. Warriors would take turns blessing the earth with their seed, believing that such an act would ensure the growth of crops or the favor of Freya, the god of abundance. Sometimes the women survived. Sometimes they didn't. What's most haunting is that these rites were not done in secret. They were witnessed, normalized, even celebrated by some. And yet, not all Norse people agreed with this path. As Christianity crept northward, bringing its saints and its sins, conflict erupted. Not on the battlefield, but within hearts. Some Viking chieftains converted, swayed by gold, or threat, or belief. Others clung to the old gods. And in this clash, something strange happened. The worst of both worlds survived. Christian law punished sex outside of marriage, but for a Viking warlord who had taken women on raids for decades, this meant little, unless it could be weaponized. So, the old sexual violence didn't end. It simply became cloaked in new justifications. A captured woman was no longer a slave, she was a heathen, and thus punishment was divine. A violent union was no longer a violation, it was a way to bring pagans under the cross. Sanctified brutality, rape in the name of salvation. Some priests protested, but many looked away. Even within Norse families, contradictions deepened. A father might teach his son the laws of honor, never strike a free woman, never harm a fellow Norseman's wife. But that same father might regale his son with tales of raids past, where nunneries were torn apart and the taste of Frankish skin was something to boast about. The young learned quickly. Honor had borders, and outside those borders there were no rules. But perhaps the most tragic figures in this transformation were the women born into the system. Not the captives, but the daughters of Vikings themselves. Because while Viking culture did, in some regions, allow women to fight, own land, and wield power, it did so on a knife's edge. A woman who dressed in armor was praised as a shield maiden, but a woman who claimed sexual agency was often called a witch. Some were accused of using cedar magic to control men. Others were drowned for being too bold or unpure. The same society that carved goddesses into its ships feared those same goddesses in human form. Female power was revered, but only when it served the masculine story, and when it didn't, it was destroyed. Even now, scholars debate what was truth and what was myth. Some argue that the Vikings weren't more violent than any other medieval culture, that their sexual customs have been exaggerated by terrified monks and biased chroniclers. Others argue the opposite, that we have romanticized the Norse to such a degree that we've scrubbed clean the crimes that defined them. But history isn't about what we're comfortable with. It's about what we're willing to look at. And when we look closely, when we peel back the runes and the longboats and the horned helmets we now know they never wore, we find something raw, something horrifying, a culture that knew how to build, how to farm, how to sing, but also how to break. A culture where sex was never just about desire, it was about power, ownership, eternity. Because in Viking belief, death was only feared if it came without purpose. A man who died in bed was pitied, but a man who died with blood on his axe and seed in his wake, he lived forever. And in this twisted logic, a woman was not just a companion. She was a vessel, a sacrifice, a tool, or worse, an afterthought. The line between love and conquest blurred beyond recognition. And as we trace that line through the ashes of burned monasteries and the bones beneath the mead halls, one thing becomes clear. The Viking Age didn't end when their ships stopped sailing. It ended when we stopped remembering what they truly left behind. And what they left behind was more than bloodlines, more than children born of silence and shame, more than the rusting hilts of axes buried under cathedral stones. What they left behind was a legacy of power shaped in flesh, reverberating far beyond their time, staining even the parts of history that tried to wash itself clean. Long after the last Viking ship had docked for good, long after the kings of Scandinavia wore crosses on their chests instead of carved hammers, the shadows of that era lingered. In law, in marriage, in the rituals that persisted quietly beneath the Christian surface. Because when brutality is woven into the roots of a society, it doesn't vanish, it mutates. It hides behind new language. By the 12th century, Norse regions had formally embraced Christianity. Churches were built where altars once dripped with animal blood. Monasteries now stood where war bands had once set fire to convents. The Viking was dead, or so Europe liked to believe. But the Viking never truly died. He was domesticated. The conqueror became the nobleman. The raider became the landowner. And the slave, she became a servant, a concubine, a forgotten ancestor. In Iceland, sagas were written down, no longer shouted by firelight, but inked carefully in vellum. They softened certain truths, turned berserkers into symbols, turned rape into romance, turned violation into adventure. The sexual violence that once defined Viking conquest was smoothed over into tales of taking brides by the sword or winning a maiden's love with strength. What was once horror became heritage. Even in today's popular culture, the Viking man is shown with storm in his eyes and desire in his hands. He's a rugged lover, a warrior poet, a misunderstood god of sex and steel. And the women? They're often written as equals, shield maidens in leather, fierce and free. But that version is as curated as any cathedral stained glass window. It is not false, but it is selective. Because beneath that fantasy lies a darker inheritance. Modern DNA studies have confirmed what oral traditions long suggested. The Viking expansion was not just a movement of trade or warfare, it was a movement of men. Overwhelmingly male, the Viking expeditions carried few women, which means the families they founded in foreign lands were built on unions with local women, unions that were rarely, if ever, consensual. In Ireland, in Scotland, in the Slavic East, generations were seeded by the violence of strangers who came from the sea, and those stories were never written down by the victors. They were endured. The church that once cursed the Norse would, centuries later, absorb many of their laws and customs. Some Scandinavian marriage rites retained elements of old fertility practices, the symbolic abduction of the bride, the veiling of the woman not for modesty, but to erase her identity as she crossed into her husband's home. These echoes are quiet, but they are there, Rituals stripped of their original context still bear the DNA of conquest. Even the language of desire was shaped by the legacy of domination. In Old Norse poetry, to love someone was often phrased in terms of seizing, capturing, mastering. Romance was not soft, it was war in miniature. And in some sagas, a woman's beauty was likened to a battlefield, her body a prize, her consent irrelevant. This cultural DNA did not dissolve with time. It was passed down like a family heirloom, in the way men spoke about women, in the way violence was excused as passion, in the way conquest was romanticized. And yet, there is one more layer to this inheritance, one more contradiction that poisons the root. Because not all Viking sexuality was outwardly violent. There existed, too, a tenderness, one shared quietly between equals, often overlooked in the chronicles. There were husbands who composed love poetry for their wives. There were women who wrote their own verses, mocking lovers who disappointed them. There were same-sex relationships, whispered about in sagas, hinted at in runes, never quite condemned but never fully accepted. There were men who loved men, warriors who shared beds and lifespans. And there were women who loved each other in the shadows of a world that demanded they birth the next generation of raiders. It would be too easy to paint the Viking world in pure darkness, just as it would be dishonest to pretend it glowed with egalitarian fire. It was both. It was a place of freedom and brutality, of ritual and raw impulse, of worship and degradation. A place where the gods changed shape and gender, but where the mortals often had no choice. So what do we do with this legacy? We carry it. Whether we know it or not, we carry it, in the myths we tell, in the fantasies we buy, in the quiet ways we excuse power when it's cloaked in charisma, in the way we celebrate conquest without asking what came before the victory. The Viking Age did not end in fire, it ended in forgetting. And perhaps the most shocking sexual practice of all, the one history never names, was the way a culture could rewrite violation as glory, silence as strength, and domination as destiny. But history remembers. In the bones of monasteries, in the faces of children who never knew their father's name, in the lullabies sung by women whose hands still bore the bruises of men called heroes, and in the sea, always in the sea, because the sea never forgets who it carried, nor what was taken beneath its waves. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.